My lords, my ladies, and everybody else here not sitting on a cushion.
So what's your podcast about?
Oh, it's about psychology, true crime, supernatural stuff, the occasional paranormal or philosophical rant.
Well, maybe I could check it out sometime.
Constantly look at things in a different way.
Your Christianity is not the cowardly, wimpish Christianity that you want to make it.
Have you ever had a dream that you were so sure was real?
Your professor calls the Crusades unprovoked Christian aggression. Hollywood depicts Crusaders as bloodthirsty zealots. The media says they were the medieval equivalent of terrorists. They're lying to you.
The terrible thing about searching for the truth is that sometimes you find it.
Just when you think you know something, you have to look at it in another way. Even though it may seem silly or wrong, you must try.
An idea, resilient, highly complete.
By 1095, Islamic armies had conquered 2/3 of the Christian world. Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, Christianity's holiest sites under the sword. Convert, pay the tax, or die. Those were your options.
What if you were unable to wake from a dream? How would you know the difference between a dream and the real one?
When Urban II called the First Crusade, it wasn't conquest, it was liberation. Christian knights didn't start a war. They finished one that had raged for 400 years.
Welcome to the real world.
But here's what should terrify you. Look at London today, Paris, Stockholm. Churches closing, mosques rising. The same territories Crusaders bled to defend are surrendering without a single sword drawn. History is repeating. This time, we're inviting the conquest.
Today, you find yourselves equals, for you are all equally blessed, for I have the pride, the privilege, nay, the pleasure of introducing to you
Truth and Shadow, your guide through the supernatural. I am your host, BT, and this is a Shadow Short. Let's navigate the unknown on this brief journey into the depths of mystery.
Once an idea has taken hold of the brain, it's almost impossible to eradicate it.
Trying to free your mind. But I can only show you the door. You're the one that has to walk through it.
An idea that is fully formed, fully understood, that sticks.
When the First Crusade concluded in the summer of 1099, it didn't leave behind some kind of political vacuum. No, it left behind new structures, new military situations, new administrative leaderships. And until that point in time, they didn't exist in this particular form. These structures are the proper subject of any serious conclusion because they determine what was possible in the centuries that follow. The most basic result of the First Crusade was territorial, but it is important to be precise about what kind of territorial change occurred. The Crusade did not merely transfer control of cities from one authority to another. No, it created new political entities that were neither continuations of earlier regimes nor organic outgrowths of local governance. They were constructed rapidly, under military pressure, and embedded within regions whose demographic, linguistic, and religious composition they did not mirror. 4 such entities emerged: the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and later the County of Tripoli. These states were not unified by geography or culture, but they were unified by their circumstance. Their borders were irregular, their internal cohesion very limited. Their continued survival was dependent upon continuous external support. These details matter because states born in this way behave differently from those that develop gradually. They do not assume stability as a default condition. They assume threat, guaranteed instability, anarchy, if you will. As a result, governance in this post-Crusade Levant became fundamentally defensive. Fortifications were designed to be central. Cities were not merely economic hubs anymore. They had become military assets. The roads, the ports, pilgrimage routes were all treated as strategic infrastructure. Political authority was inseparable from the capacity to deploy force quickly and repeatedly. And this had become the normal condition, even though some may have thought it to be temporary. It's with the Kingdom of Jerusalem that illustrates this transformation more clearly. After 1099, the city of Jerusalem ceased to function primarily as a shared sacred city governed through overlapping traditions and customary access. Instead, it became a capital, and capitals impose order where the historical continuity is layered. To govern Jerusalem as a capital required decisions that had not been previously necessary. Who could reside within the city? Who could administer sacred sites? Who would enforce the law across all the religious boundaries? Especially how disputes would be resolved when customs offered no single answer. These were not mere abstract questions. They were daily administrative realities. The result was a city whose political identity was narrower than its spiritual significance. And this kind of mismatch created a tension, not because of any unique moral failure, but because the sovereignty simplifies it by design. States require clarity. Sacred history rarely provides it. So the First Crusade therefore produced a lasting transformation of sacred geography, if you will. Places that had once been primary sites of devotion became sites of control or administration. Access became regulated. Protection offered was militarized. The pilgrimage became an economic system intertwined with the security of the land. This shift did not end when the Crusader states fell. Once this sacred space had been governed as a territory, it could not easily return to it being governed solely by tradition. And beyond Jerusalem, the Crusader states as a whole shared a defining characteristic. They were ruled populations that did not resemble their ruling elite. Latin Christians constituted a minority, Eastern Christians, Muslims, and Jews, the majority. Governance therefore relied on a layered form of negotiated coexistence. And then, to back that, this implicit threat of force. Well, this arrangement was not inherently unstable, but it was inherently resource intensive. It required soldiers, rulers, settlers, clergy that had to arrive continuously from outside the region. The states could not replenish themselves with their own demographic. Their political survival depended on maintaining links to distant homelands. This is a critical result of the First Crusade, and it's often overlooked. As a consequence, these boundaries between war and peace are blurred. This mobilization did not end with a victory. The armies remained. The garrisons simply rotated bodies. Defensive readiness became routine. While warfare ceased to be an episodic response to crisis, it instead became a permanent condition of governance. This normalization of readiness was what reshaped the political authority itself. The rulers were not evaluated only on justice or piety, but on their ability to maintain defense of the strategic locations in their areas. Legitimacy became tied to military competence, which meant failure to protect territory was not merely a strategic error, it was also a political and moral failing. And it was from within this environment that new forms of institution emerged. Military service happened to have acquired religious dimensions that were continuous instead of just exceptional. Over time, this new thought would crystallize into permanent military religious orders. But the underlying logic appeared immediately after 1099. The defense of sacred territory was no longer a temporary obligation. It had become an enduring vocation. This represented a significant shift in how violence was justified and organized. The First Crusade did not invent this religious war. Instead, it formalized it. It provided a working model in which armed force, then spiritual merit, and institutional continuity could all be aligned. Another structural consequence followed from this alignment. Law adapted to accommodate it. So property rights, inheritance, taxation were all recalibrated around these kind of defensive needs. Land was no longer merely held for production, but for strategic value. Revenue streams were redirected toward fortification and manpower. In this way, the post-Crusade world developed a political economy shaped by insecurity. Prosperity was valuable insofar as it sustained defense. Peace was desirable insofar as it allowed preparation for the next possible conflict. None of this requires attributing unique intent or moral character to any group involved. These are predictable outcomes of states formed under siege conditions. The First Crusade, in short, produced a frontier system. Not a frontier system of exploration, but a frontier of endurance. It established a zone in which political authority existed in a constant state of justification through force. That system did not dissolve when individual rulers changed. Instead, it outlasted generations, and it trained new leaders, it conditioned all of the population, and it in fact shaped expectations about what authority looked like in contested sacred space. And because of its endurance, it became a form of precedent. That precedent, more than the initial victory of the First Crusade, even more than the symbolism of Jerusalem, it became the most important structural result of that crusade. And it taught later generations that conquest was not merely possible, but that settlement under permanent threat was viable. Now, whether that lesson was misunderstood, misapplied, or overextended is a question for later analysis. What matters here is that the lesson exists at all. By 1099, the First Crusade had concluded as a military campaign. What it left behind was a new political situation, one in which faith, territory, and force were no longer episodically connected, but structurally independent. One of the clearest institutional results of the First Crusade was the transformation of governance from an episodic exercise of power into a continuous administrative project under military constraint. The Crusader states did not merely rule, they had to manage. And management, especially under conditions of insecurity, required systems of control. This new form of politic of the Levant inherited little usable administrative infrastructure. They did not simply step in to intact bureaucracies. Instead, they had to adapt fragments. Byzantine practices, Islamic administrative customs, local legal traditions, all of this combined with Latin feudal concepts. The result was not a clean transplant of European governance, nor a preservation of regional systems. Instead, it became this hybrid environment. This hybridization of the administrative environment was not accidental. It was necessary. The Latin ruling elite lacked the numbers and local familiarity required to govern directly at every level. And as a result, they relied heavily on existing structures of taxation, land management, and urban administration, even as sovereignty shifted. This produced a form of rule that was pragmatic rather than ideological. All of the law was applied unevenly, not out of negligence, but because uniform enforcement was literally impossible. Different communities operated under different legal expectations. What mattered was not theoretical coherence, but stability. However, stability under these conditions required predictable revenue. And that means one of the most significant administrative outcomes of the First Crusade was the reorientation of the economic life around defense and access. These Crusader states did not possess large agrarian hinterlands capable of sustaining prolonged conflict independently. Instead, they depended on the urban centers, those ports, the pilgrimage routes I mentioned before. And pilgrimage became more than a religious act, it became this economic engine. It secured more of the roads, it secured a lot of the ports, and it turned a lot of the cities into more than just a matter of piety or safety. It was a matter of fiscal survival. So we see the addition of fees or tolls, mandatory quote-unquote donations, and all of the trade flowed along these routes. This created a kind of feedback loop. Security enabled pilgrimage, pilgrimage funded security. Over time, those administrative priorities aligned themselves with this cycle. Resources were directed toward maintaining the routes rather than integrating territories. The states became networks instead of cohesive regions. Land tenure reflected this reality. Land was granted not simply for cultivation, but for military obligation. Holdings were assessed based on defensive value as much as productivity. And this further tied political legitimacy to martial capacity. Taxation followed a similar logic. Revenue collection emphasized immediacy and reliability over long-term development. The goal was not economic transformation, but something that could last, something that could endure. And this ended up constraining innovation and instead reinforced dependency on external support. And at the same time, the ecclesiastical, the church, expanded alongside this secular governance. So we see churches, monasteries, clerical offices are all being established rapidly, not merely to serve spiritual needs, but to anchor Latin authority in the region. Control of sacred sites carried administrative weight. Clerical presence reinforced claims of legitimacy. So here we see another lasting consequence, the fusion of ecclesiastical and ruling elite in frontier conditions. The clergy were not only spiritual leaders, they ended up being record keepers, negotiators, go-betweens. Their institutional continuity offered stability where secular authority was frequently disrupted by warfare. And this fusion of concepts altered expectations about the role of religious institutions. They were no longer solely custodians of doctrine and ritual. They became active participants in politic, in landholding. This shift didn't remain confined to the Levant. It ends up influencing broader developments further into the centuries we go. And perhaps the most distinctive institutional development associated with the post-Crusade world was the emergence of permanent military religious organizations. Knights Hospitalier, other groups who became the Knights Templar, for example. While fully developed orders arose later, that logic designed within them was already present by the early 12th century. The problem these institutions addressed was structure. How to maintain a continual defensive force without relying solely on short-term levies or distant reinforcements. So the solution was to bind military service to religious vocation and institutional permanence. So this wasn't merely an invitation in warfare. Instead, it was this breakthrough. It created organizations that could own land, they could collect revenue, train people, and then deploy forces across regions with some kind of level of autonomy. And that meant their loyalty would be to the state rather than to feudal individuals. So once established, this model proved highly adaptable. It did not depend on the survival of the original Crusader states. And we see that through history that they survived. And this reveals a key point about that First Crusade's institutional legacy. Its most influential creations outlived its territorial gains. Another one of the big consequences that we see is the normalization of legal exceptionalism. Frontier conditions required flexibility. Emergency measures became routine. The improvisation of legality practice became standard. Over time, this eroded clear distinction between ordinary governance and crisis governance. In such environments, authority is often justified retrospectively by necessity rather than principle. So decisions are defended because they worked, not because they aligned with pre-existing norms. And that meant exceptional measures, once normalized, tend to persist when conditions change. What we do know is the records from the period reflect this tension. There's charters, laws, decrees, and they often emphasize defense, obligation, loyalty. Some forms of rights were framed, created conditionally. Privileges were tied to service, and authority is justified through the ability to protect. And so, while it looked like some form of tyranny, what we're looking at is a kind of a governance under constraint. This created a kind of feedback loop. So, if we're to understand the lasting results of the First Crusade, we must move beyond the territory and institutions and consider something less visible but more durable: precedent. Because history is not only shaped by what happens, but by what later generations believe has been proven possible, justified, or effective. The First Crusade mattered not simply because it succeeded, but because it appeared to succeed decisively. It produced tangible outcomes. We have states, access to Holy Land, authorities, and all of that could be pointed to, it could be remembered, it could be cited in documents. And once outcomes can be cited, well, they can become arguments to continue it. In the decades after 1099, the First Crusade was not remembered primarily as a desperate gamble contingent on fragmentation, coincidence, and temporary advantage. It was remembered as a model. Later actors did not inherit the uncertainty of the original participants. They inherited the result. And results, detached from their conditions, become misleading teachers. What was remembered was not the fragility of the Crusader states, but their existence, not the improvisation of governance, but its endurance, not the exhaustion of victory, but the fact that victory occurred at all. This misalignment between history and reality had consequences. The First Crusade established the idea that sacred objectives could be pursued through sustained political and military structures, and that doing so could produce lasting change. And then once that belief took hold, it shaped expectations, and it reframed future decision-making, and it encouraged repetition. Legal and theological justifications for violence did not emerge in a vacuum after 1099. They emerged in response to facts on the ground. The territory had been taken, new states had been formed, authority had been exercised, law followed practice. This sequence matters. When law is constructed to explain an existing condition, it tends to preserve that condition rather than question it. The result is not simply justification, but normalization. Over time, exceptional measures hardened into accepted frameworks. Arguments initially made to explain necessity become new principles. Temporary arrangements become precedents. And what had once required explanation began to require only reference. This is the most consequential legacies of the First Crusade. It shifted the burden of proof. Instead of asking whether sacred violence could be sustained institutionally, later generations asked only whether they could replicate the outcome. And by the 12th and 13th centuries, the First Crusade no longer functioned primarily as an episode. It was basically a foundational story. And that embedded a new form of precedent. And when precedent becomes ambient rather than explicit, well, it shapes the behavior without being questioned. The First Crusade contributed to this process by demonstrating that instability could be governed indefinitely, that insecurity could be normalized, that contested sacred space could be administered through permanent readiness rather than resolution. And this was not a conclusion anyone articulated in 1099. It emerged over time. So later crusades struggled not because they misunderstood faith, but because they misunderstood the conditions. They inherited a precedent without inheriting the circumstances that made it possible. They assumed durability where fragility had been the reality. In this sense, the First Crusade cast a long shadow not because it created a single conflict, but because it altered how conflict itself was understood. It taught that war could fund order, and order could be maintained through violence. Once those assumptions were absorbed, disengagement becomes difficult. Structures built to manage insecurity, they resist dismantling, and institutions designed for endurance justify always their own continuation. The First Crusade ended as an event in 1099, but it was a framework for understanding how faith, power, and violence could coexist structurally. It became part of the historical story through which later societies interpreted sacred conflict, if you will. To recognize this is not to assign blame or praise. It is to acknowledge causality. History does not repeat itself mechanically, but it does repeat false assumptions. And the assumptions forged after the First Crusade about legitimacy, defense, space, law proved remarkably resilient. If there is a conclusion in sight to draw, it is this. The most enduring outcomes of historical events are rarely the ones commemorated. They are the ones embedded quietly into practice, law, expectations. And that meant this crusade's lasting result was not the capture of Jerusalem. It was the normalization of a world in which such captures could be governed, defended, and remembered as precedent. That world did not disappear when the walls changed hands. It continued because it needed to.
You take the blue pill. The story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill. You stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
Thank you for listening. This is a free podcast based upon the value for value model. If you find value in this, or any episode, you can return that value by liking the show, subscribing to this channel, leaving a review, or sharing with a friend on your social media accounts. You can also donate on my website. Thank you again. This is BT for Truth and Shadow Podcast. You are the light in the darkness.
It's a very strange, funny time. Everybody would love to be able to be themselves.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. You take the red pill. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more. You stay in Wonderland. Believe whatever you want to believe.
Every battle, everywhere, always. Every possible series of events is happening all at once. Live that way, and nothing will surprise you. Everything that happens will be something that you've seen before.
They must fall in line. The person who fell with. You want to live that kind of life? I wish you the best. I'll be on the other side somewhere.
The truth, nothing more.